Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the second chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to cover the first 11 verses after we lay the foundation of the preamble of the first chapter. What really sets the tone for the book itself is the second verse. Futility, futility, says Quoleth. Futility, futility. All is futile. Quoleth is Solomon, and the word futile translates, the word Quoleth in the Hebrew original translates as preacher or teacher, so it is unusual to have those offices combined in a king, but both David and Solomon were in the practice of addressing audiences in a preacherly capacity. The word futile itself in the Hebrew original translates as hay bal, and this describes mist or vapor or wind. On only 3 of the 78 occasions in the Old Testament is it used to describe physical or literal mist. In the other 75, 35 of which appear in the book of Ecclesiastes, this book and this concept saturates the entire book. It is described to alternately translated as vanity or meaningless or futile, so it's to no apparent purpose. It's not it's just the why he is writing this book is answered in his quest for meaning of life. He is a man motivated to discover the meaning of life. More than that, he is a king with all the wealth and all the wisdom in the world, but that is not enough. He has every measurable amount of satisfaction, yet he is unsatisfied because the meaning of life evades him. What does man gain from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? The question he asks in verse 3 repeats and abounds not only in the first chapter but also in the second. It gets past the point of what we're going to cover today, but we do read of his efforts at achievement, his ambitious building projects and creative projects. He was not a lazy person, but the question he asks is, what is the point of purpose that man should be motivated, that civilization should be animated for an achievement? After all, there is nothing new that transpires under the sun. He describes the observable universe as such, beginning in verse 4, a generation passes away and a generation comes, but the earth stands forever. He describes the universe as in perpetual flux, yet locked in a pattern of permanence. So the generation, the people who inhabit this earth, they come and go, but the earth stands forever. The pattern evades also in the rising and the setting of the sun, and in the wind, and in the rivers. All matters are wearisome. No one is able to speak of it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with its hearing. That word all appears once more. He describes everything as futile. In the second chapter, he gets more specific. Towards the tail end of the first chapter, he describes the futility of wisdom. In the passage we're going to read today, he describes the futility of pleasure. After that, wisdom once more, and then toil or working and all this stuff. So that sets the tone. But in any case, he is exhausted, having seen everything that there is to see. Solomon adopts the eye of the scientist with that of the observation, and he says this in the 9th verse: "What has been is what shall be. What has been done is what shall be done, and there is none new under the sun." From the eyes of sight, he is completely correct. There is nothing that can take place in the observable universe that is truly, truly unique. But through the eyes of faith, all things become new. All the old things pass away. The new life, the new birth. There's also the new Jerusalem. And there's a passage of Isaiah where Yahweh says, "Behold, I will do a new thing." So Solomon's problem is that it's not his problem. He is adopting the vantage point of a pessimist, secularist, rationalist person, but he presents that viewpoint as with a hidden premise of demolishing and dismantling, that he eventually brings himself to acknowledge that a God-centered life is one with meaning and purpose, but the word God doesn't appear until the tail end of the second chapter. And then the next section of the first chapter, he says, "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all that has been done under the heavens. This evil task Elohim has given to the sons of man to be humbled by it." Solomon was endowed with supernatural endowment of wisdom to an unprecedented and unduplicated extent in the most biographically significant moment of his life, when he is a 19-year-old, recently ascended to the throne. His his power consolidated. He is visited by Elohim in a dream, who grants him one wish, a blank check, and he asks for wisdom, and it is an oversimplification to suggest that he was devoid of wisdom prior to the asking, because he had the wisdom to ask. He also had the humility, the awesomeness of the nation he was to lead, and the awesomeness of the God he was to serve and represent on the earth, and he was humbled by it. That so wisdom, one of the side effects of wisdom is humbled. We become aware of things that we cannot know, and the wiser we become, the more aware of our ignorance we are, and we are humbled by it. So the questions that wisdom literature asks, there are no easy answers to it. Nevertheless, we probe in an almost not a futile effort, but certainly not one with immediate results. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and see all was futile and feeding on wind. That phrase, feeding on wind, appears about 14 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, and is closely connected to the concept of futility, the idea of doing something to no avail. One cannot feed on wind successfully. But he has seen all the works. That word all appears once more, so there is nothing that does not escape his notice. He is a diligent observer, and he has the resources as the king to conduct such an experiment, such as the escape into hedonism that we read of briefly in the chapter we're going to go. He would have had the resources to do that beyond the ordinary persons to do. Verse 16, so I spoke to my heart, saying, see, I have attained greatness, and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. And my heart has seen much wisdom and knowledge. No clearer case for Solomonic authorship can be made than these words right here. Solomon was the embodiment and the personification of the Hebrew wisdom tradition. He was the idea of a philosopher king, a king who united power with wisdom, the embodiment of the ideal of Plato. Some 4 centuries later, he was the actual embodiment of this. He was the wisest man who ever lived. His superiority and supremacy of wisdom is indicated over all. It outshone all the men of the East, the wise men of the East, in the 4th chapter of the first book of Kings. So this is not an idle boast. He is not bragging. He is telling the truth here. And I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly, and I know this too is feeding on wind. In the section after the section we're going to cover today, he debates the relative merits of wisdom and folly. So his experimental conclusion when wisdom ends up being futile, as we read in the next verse. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases suffering. So that explains the futility of wisdom. Wisdom does make life better. It enables us to navigate, but there is also a pain and a price to wisdom. The wiser we become, the more aware of imperfections and evil we are, and the more disillusioned and disheartened we are by it. Nevertheless, this is our cross to endure, and one we have to endure willingly. So we have to be prepared to pay the price of wisdom, which is greater grief and an increase of suffering. But this suffering, this very grievous nature of the results of his diligent experiments in wisdom, compelled him to seek escape to it in hedonism. But twice we read the phrase, I did not abandon wisdom, while he is pursuing these alternate avenues of satisfaction. He is a man motivated by the quest for the source of the ultimate satisfaction in life, and wisdom fails to deliver. It makes him sadder, and so this forms the basis of the 2nd chapter, first verse lesson itself. I said in my heart, come now, let me try you with rejoicing, and find out what is good. But see, that too was futile. He is not seeking to escape. He is seeking to discover. And here I'm going to borrow the words of Derek Kidnar, author of The Message of Ecclesiastes, who says it better than I could ever hope to. So he comments, he notes at once the paradox of hedonism, that the more you hunt for pleasure, the less of it you find. The instantaneousness of the conclusion that he reached at wisdom is described more efficiently with less verbs. It's almost instant. And to give an example of seeking, of being evaded what you seek, we can describe the life of a heroin addict. Heroin is a very peaceful drug, and people Yet people do violent things for it, because as the nature of the addiction intensifies, it becomes not about seeking pleasure, but avoiding the excruciating pain of heroin withdrawal. So that is the paradox of pleasure. It's a great thing at first, but the more you hunt for it, the less of it you find. And the Apostle Paul also says, she who lives in pleasure is dead while they live, and what is true for women is true for female. But Solomon is not seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake. In any case, he is looking for something beyond it and through it, for this is more than the simple indulgence. It is a deliberate flight from rationality to get at some secret of life to which reason may be blocking the way. Since wisdom doesn't have the answer that he's seeking, he is prepared to abandon it and categorically pursue its opposite, yet it is the very wisdom which compels him to launch this line of thought in his experiment. But in any case, the results are the same. It is futile, just like everything else in nature, and all that times you read that it is. So what is futile of working and wisdom is futile of pleasure. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of rejoicing, what does it do? There is nothing wrong with laughing. Laughing is all well and good, but it is a species of happiness, not of joy. The difference between joy and happiness is joy is enduring. Happiness is fleeting, as it is dependent on circumstances, whereas joy transcends circumstances. So when you laugh, the satisfaction that does not long outlast the laugh. Laughing can feel good. Sometimes it feels better than sex. But the effects are so ephemeral, and he's in search and in quest and pursuit of something that will bring him permanent satisfaction. So the problem with laughter is you have to keep on laughing, and then it eventually loses its luster and fades away. And it is a species of madness. Madness is synonymous with folly, and he is motivated by wisdom. So he also compares and contrasts the relative merits of wisdom and madness more fully, as indicated in the 17th verse of the first chapter. He does that more fully in the section after the section we're going to cover. I searched in my heart how to stimulate my body with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold of folly, until I could see what was good for the sons of men to do under the heavens, all the days of their lives. So he is searching in his heart. Now the heart is the center of the emotion, volitions, and will. So the heart is the controlling element of the person, and that is precisely where he is searching. And what he searches to do is to stimulate himself with wine. As a king, he would have had access to the best wine, the best food, the highest quality caliber stuff in the kingdom. So the wine that he had wouldn't have been ordinary wine. It would have been the best tasting, and but he still does not abandon wisdom. It is wisdom which motivates the pursuit. He is not completely forsaking. He retains his wisdom even as he indulges. Now, it would take a lifetime of hedonism to undo the wisdom that he had accumulated. He holds fast to the wisdom that he has. It is out of wisdom that he is pursuing the antithesis of conventional wisdom, because conventional wisdom, when a conventional wisdom fails, he is prepared to discard the item, the sacrosanct item of wisdom. And it is the axiomatic assumption of wisdom that wisdom does give life meaning, and but wisdom apart from God cannot do what wisdom with God. The God-given wisdom is where the meaning of life is found, but he's not even close to there yet. He's embracing foolishness just as out of the experimental ethos. He is ready to categorically consider the unthinkable in his pursuit, his mad quest for this source of satisfaction, which eludes him and evades him. And his motivation and intention are sincere. His quest is not selfish. It is not insular. He is doing what he is doing as king in order to provide the common man with the answer for the meaning of life. And Solomon, even though he was as a king, he could not strictly speaking relate to the common people in ways that his father was, who grew up in the sheep pen, and then he was not born into royalty, not born into a palace. Nevertheless, Solomon had extraordinary empathy and insight, and he knew that the dilemmas that he was going through were common. They just aren't as articulate in any of and the majority of human beings. But the question that he is asking, what is the meaning of life, is a question that is asked by people in Africa, it is asked by people in Asia, it is asked by people in Europe, in North and South America, in Oceania, and not only asked everywhere in the world, but every time in the world. These questions are truly universal. But here the narrative transitions. We don't hear much of the hedonistic escapes. That didn't last very long, because the pleasures derived from pleasure itself, the pursuit of immediate gratification, the satisfaction of the carnal appetites, is so ephemeral. Whereas he had been wise all his life. He had been wise to begin with, and then he became wise beyond measure beginning in the age 19. This is the latest, most mature musings of Solomon's, of the 3 books that are written by him in the Bible. Song of Solomon is believed to represent his youthful years, perhaps before the temple was built, which he completed at the age of 30. And then Proverbs is his middle years. This is his apex of wisdom and prestige. And the Ecclesiastes is sort of in his declining years. He's getting away and apart from the God who had appeared to him twice in a vision. But he transitions to something productive, something creative. There is, he is advancing civilization, yet all the buildings that he has made lie in ruin today. I made my works great. I built myself houses. I planted vineyards for myself. The description of the house that he built for himself, which took him 13 years, whereas the temple took him 7 years, but that is just because he had greater attention and emphasis to building the temple. And it's quite possible that the building of his palace overlapped with the building of his temple, and but that is described in the seventh chapter of the first book of Kings. The Chronicles accounts are exclusively oriented to the temple, and the temple is the focal and emphasis of the King's account. Anyway, the bulk of the majority of the material about Solomon are related to the temple, its design and its dedication and its building, and it is the main thing that was what he was born to do, and he did it. He inherited the throne when he was 19 years old. He began constructing in the 4th year of his reign, 1 Kings 6:1, and then finished it after 7 years. So he is 30 years old. You do the math. 19 plus 11 equals 30. So at the same age that his father had ascended to the throne, his main mission in life was complete. And this launches just a vacancy in him that develops and fully manifests when he is almost twice as old. And vineyards would have been common. Vineyards and all the things would have been common for Oriental monarchs. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. One example of a royal garden was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Adorned on the walls were gardens that reminded one of the king's wives, his favorite wife, who was not from a distant land, a mountainous land, where there were the things that weren't grown in Babylon. So the king took it upon himself to adorn the walls of his city with hanging gardens to please his wife and make her feel more at home. But Solomon had gardens too, and parks. These are things common to kings. And, he would have planted fruit trees and ate from the trees, and they would have been his personal property in his possession. He would have more than a more ordinary amount of acreage to do these things. I made pools of water for myself, to water them a plantation of growing trees. Pools of water were necessary because water is essential for so many things, and yet its inaccessibility in Jerusalem, which was unique among the ancient cities, not attached to any river. It was on a mountainous plain. All the other cities grew up and around the river, so pools would have been especially essential for the Jerusalem-dwelling people. But this also enabled irrigation for the growing of trees, not just Solomon's, but anyone else who wanted to grow a tree. I bought male and female servants, and I came to have sons of the household. And I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Kings trafficked, they had many servants, and this is alternately translated as slave, and that may or may not be accurate. Solomon lived in a slave holding society, but the Hebrews were distinct in the practice, and that they had limitations on how long they could own someone, and how they could not have limits in how far they could treat them. But Solomon, we could imagine, would have been a benign master, and he had several, an inordinate amount of servants. Just the palace, the managing of his palace, in testament to Solomon's ingenuity, he not only organized the arrangement for the feeding of his own palace, but also arranged that of Hiram, the king of Tyre, who was a friend of his father's David, older than Solomon but younger than David. Solomon enabled his palace, which was 80% of the total amount of his own palace. He did that too, so that's where the word household comes in. But the unrivaled and unprecedented extents of his possession are indicated. This also makes a clear-cut case for Solomonic authorship. He was the wisest as well as the wealthiest king who ever lived. And I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and of the provinces. I provided male and female singers for myself, and the pleasure of men, a woman and women. Silver and gold. Now, gold was so plentiful in the era of Solomon that silver was deemed, it lost its value. It was so common. He had 300 gold shields in his throne room, which were scooped up by the Egyptians during the 5th year of his son Rehoboam's reign. And then he replaced them with bronze. But everything in the temple was laid with gold. Gold was plentiful in the reign of Solomon, in the amount of 666 talents annually came from the land of Ophir, which the location of which is unidentified and mysterious. But in any case, he also received tributary from kings because he was so powerful and so prestigious and so wealthy. Other kings gave him gifts as tokens of and gestures of respect. He also had his own people, the provinces, the 12 tribes and territories of his kingdom, which he arranged to extract taxation from, and his excess of taxation also proved to be his undoing. But the undoing of his kingdom, it provoked ire and resentment and wrath. But also indicated female and male singers. Music would have accompanied any courts. The ancients did not have the luxury of cell phones upon which we can instantly play any song we want. They would have had to have people there in their vicinity and location to perform music for them. And this was a sign of wealth to be able to have that, and power and prestige. And I think this is a woman, and women is often translated as harem, and harems would have been common to ancient Oriental despots. But Solomon got carried away. Eventually he acquired 700 wives and 300 concubines. And his love for his foreign wives compelled him to compromise with their idolatry, allowing them to set up shop in Jerusalem, thus contaminating the moral fiber and the spiritual health of the land. His love for his wives, but the concubines were also, they would have just existed for the king's sexual pleasure, whereas wives were often arranged marriages for diplomatic and political purpose. Love had almost nothing to do with royal marriages, yet Solomon loved enough of them to compromise and become an idolater and hasten his death prematurely, because at the biographically significant moment of his life when he was 19 years old, he was given not only what he asked for, wisdom, but so pleased was Elohim with his answer that he gave him that which he did not ask for, which was wealth and prestige beyond measure, unprecedented and unduplicated. And the other thing he gave him was conditional. The first two were unconditional, but as long as he remained obedient to the covenant, he could have lived as long as he wanted to, but he only made it to be 59 years. So Solomon, even though he is exalted as a hero, is ultimately a tragic figure his failure. All the wisdom, he did not heed his own counsel. Of the wisdom, he did not heed his own wisdom, though the wisdom he offers is without parallel among any ancient or modern, Yahshua accepted. Thus I became great and increased more than all who were before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom remained with me. The accumulation of the vast sums of wealth was closely connected to his wisdom, so it was his very wisdom which enabled him to prosper commercially and financially and materially, and to bring in all this wealth, so much so that silver was accounted for as next to worthless because gold was so plentiful. So his greatness, once more, he is not bragging, he is telling the truth. He was great, his prestige was unrivaled. A queen came from 1,000 miles away to sit at his feet and listen to his wisdom, and there were no questions too difficult that the Queen of Sheba asked that he could not answer. And the unprecedented Jerusalem would witness its apex of influence. Her golden age coincided with the reign of Solomon, and it was because of Solomon that it all happened. And all that my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion from all my labor. He had access, he could efficiently access everything that he desired. All the lust of the eyes could have been his at a whim. So this was a temptation as a king that we do not have. But he was determined to find satisfaction by any means necessary, and because pleasure and hedonism were one of the available options, he did not withhold himself. He went all the way, but it was only for a brief period of time. But he was proud of his work. He had accomplished all these things, even though he ultimately questions the worthiness of it, because all the things that he built, including the house that took him 13 years to build, it must have been a magnificent palace. It doesn't stand anymore. It's in ashes and ruins. But he eventually, by the conclusion of the second verse, we hear the first faithful, positive answer, and that is to embrace the gifts. We are entitled to enjoy the fruits of our labor, and portion is a word that relates to that. But when I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on all the labors in which I had toiled, see, all was futile and feeding on wind, and there was no gain under the sun. So we almost went through a positive, blissful interlude. We haven't heard the word futile since the first verse, but that futility is there start to finish. He seeks relief and escapement, but he is not trying to escape in his experimental indulgence and hedonism. What he is trying to do is discover something. If wisdom doesn't have the answer, then maybe folly and pleasure do. And yet he is disappointed by this verse. We describe that he was an outstanding report card of achievement in building projects, and by measurable amounts he had advanced civilization just to beyond the ordinary king, and yet he declares it folly. He finds no point or purpose to working as hard as he did, because he is haunted by the glooming hour of his own death. So much of Ecclesiastes is motivated by a sense of the fear of death, but he does bring himself to a satisfactory conclusion. But that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. That's all the time we have for today, and the lesson we're going to cover after this. He experiments, he compares and contrasts the relative merits of wisdom and folly, in the hopes that maybe folly knows something that wisdom does not, yet he is disappointed, and he expounds more fully on the state of his dissatisfaction, on the futility of labor, and then he brings himself to the conclusion that it's a gift from God, and it is not unrighteous. We are entitled to enjoy what we work for. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.